All right. Well, thank you for coming back after the break. Right now, we're going to start our panel on demonstrations, direct action, resistance, and counter-recruitment. So we have 3 panelists today, and I'll introduce them individually. So Mark Engler is our first panelist. He is an editorial board member at Dissent, a contributing editor at Yes Magazine, and a senior analyst with Foreign Policy in Focus. Mark has served as a commentator for the Institute of Public Accuracy and for the Mainstream Media Project. His new book is This is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century. You're welcome to come up to the stand.
Okay, thank you. Great. Well, I want to thank the organizers for having me here. It's an honor to be on a panel with Medea Benjamin and Pat Elder, so thank you. David Swanson, the organizers, asked me to come today to talk a little bit about my book, which is, the book is here. It's called This is an Uprising. And this is a book about how protest movements work, how they work to create change from outside the formal political system. And it's a book about how using mass protest and nonviolent direct action are a little bit different than some other types of organizing. Now, each of us today is only going to speak for less than 15 minutes, so I can only give you a very brief overview of some of the things that I'm writing about in the book. But I'll be around after the panel. We have some books available back at the World Beyond War table, and I'm happy to talk with folks there. So I wrote this book with my younger brother, Paul, and along with our older brother, Francis, we grew up in Iowa in a family that has roots in the peace and justice tradition of the Catholic Church. My dad was a priest and my mom was a nun. That's the proof right there. And they decided to leave. That's right. They decided to leave the ministry in the early 70s to have a family. That's me on the far left there, rocking the jumpsuit. I want to remind everyone this was the 1970s. And so my parents were supporters of the Catholic worker movement. I give a lot of talks to audiences where no one knows what the Catholic worker movement is. I don't think that's a problem in this room. Many people are familiar, obviously, with the workers. So growing up around the Catholic worker in Des Moines, Iowa, we were exposed to activists who would do dramatic actions in the plowshares tradition. These were actions to protest the immorality of nuclear war, like sneaking onto military bases and trying to disable bombs or war equipment. And these were really risky actions, and when the workers were arrested, they'd often spend years at a time in jail. And on the one hand, I grew up really admiring these people and their ability to create small, intense communities of people willing to make these huge personal sacrifices for the causes of peace and justice. But on the other hand, as my brothers and I started getting more and more involved in politics, we noticed something. We noticed that there wasn't a lot of discussion in Catholic worker circles about whether these sacrifices were really being effective in creating the type of change that we need. People would talk a lot about bearing witness or about speaking truth to power. There's even a saying in the Catholic worker that Jesus never told us to be successful, only to be faithful. And I think that there's a need for us to challenge ourselves on this point. We can't be satisfied with just being in the right, morally speaking. We need to be strategic, and we need to look at how protest movements can actually force change. So as my brothers and I got more and more involved, we became interested in finding people who were organizing to build power and who were forming the movements of the kind of size and strength that we really need to create change. And that led us to a couple different places. One place was to the labor movement. My brothers and I have all worked on labor campaigns. My older brother, Francis, remains a union organizer. And the other place was to people doing nonviolent direct action, but doing direct action that was not meant just to be an individual act of moral witness, but instead people who had a real goal of building mass movements. And a next formative experience for me and Paul related to what the media was calling the anti-globalization movement and what activists called the global justice movement. This movement exploded onto the scene after protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle in November 1999. I was there in Seattle. I know Medea was as well, and maybe some others here were too. How many people? We got a few hands. Great. Awesome. So, in Seattle, there was a huge protest. Somewhere around 50,000 people were there. It brought together this amazing coalition of union members, environmentalists, family farmers, indigenous rights activists, all opposed to the politics of corporate globalization. And something like 10,000 people did a direct action where they surrounded the convention center and actually shut down the openings of the WTO meetings. Ultimately, the city is clouded with tear gas, and Bill Clinton declares martial law, and this becomes a huge media event. I was in Seattle. My brother Paul was not. But for both of us, this was a very influential moment. And that's because it was very different than the type of organizing that we had experienced before. When we had done student activism around anti-sweatshop issues or living wages on campuses or environmental issues, organizers would have to work really intensely just to get maybe 10 people to show up for a meeting or to come to a protest, right? And we were used to doing demonstrations that maybe got a little two-line mention in the paper if they got mentioned at all. And then all of a sudden, this protest in Seattle exploded into the headlines, and the political climate totally changed. People were flooding into activist meetings. Hundreds of people said that they were willing to go to jail. There was all of this energy that seemed to break the rules of traditional organizing. And that was all very exciting. But within a year or so, it all fell apart. The energy was gone, and that became a very disorienting time. We were trying to figure out what had happened and why did that happen. And at that point, Paul went to work as an organizer in the labor movement. I was working as a journalist, writing on international trade, on labor issues, on Latin American affairs. And this experience that we had sort of went onto the back burner. But over time, we started to notice something. Every once in a while, these moments of mass revolt would happen again. It was not a one-time thing. So there was another explosion of movement activity around the Iraq War in 2003, which I think most people here were probably a part of. And then there was another explosion around immigrant rights in 2006 when millions of people took to the street in Los Angeles and beyond. Then there was a full year of explosions in 2011 with the Arab Spring and with Occupy Wall Street. And now we're seeing it again with the movement for Black Lives. And one thing we noticed is that every time one of these things would happen, the media would treat it in the same way. They called it spontaneous. They called it unplanned. They called it emotional. They called it uncontrolled. They said it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But once we started looking, we saw that these once-in-a-lifetime events were actually happening all the time. The same year as Occupy, there were mass protests in Spain and in much of Europe. Then there were huge demonstrations of students in Quebec and in Chile. There were eruptions in Mexico, in Turkey, in Brazil, in Hong Kong. And we started to think, why aren't these accounted for in our vision of social change? Why don't we understand these as part of how our societies progress? Why are we always taken by surprise? And then we noticed another trend. It wasn't just the media or the public at large that didn't really know how to handle these eruptions. It was also true in the activist world. Many of the organizers that we most respected from the world of labor and community organizing actually didn't have much to say when these moments, these explosions of revolt would break out. And in some cases, they were even very dismissive of them. They said, you can't rely on these things. They don't build up organization. They flare up and then they die out. Because of that, they sort of chose to ignore these outbreaks. And as a result of this, we saw that there was a gap between the worlds of what we call structure-based organizing on the one side and the world of mass protest on the other. Now, in the world of structure-based organizing in unions and in community groups, the techniques and methodologies are very well mapped out. There are books like Rules for Radicals or the Midwest Academy Handbook, all sorts of guides for how to organize in that model. But the dynamics of mass mobilizations were much more murky and mysterious. So we thought, well, what if we don't treat these things as flukes? What if we really study their dynamics? What if we get to the bottom of how to sustain outbreaks of revolt when they happen, how to harness their power, and maybe even how we can create uprisings from scratch? And this book grew out of an investigation into all of those issues. Now, given our time today, unfortunately, I'm not able to do much more than give this kind of very broad introduction to the issues that I'm talking about. But I do want to make one final point, which is that when we understand the differences between some of these organizing traditions, between some of these different approaches to creating social change, it allows us to evaluate all sorts of issues in new ways. It affects our understanding of when it's appropriate to use tactics that might be polarizing or controversial. It affects our decisions about when we need to have very specific technical types of policy demands and when it's more important to be focused on cultivating a wide sense of moral injustice that the broad public can see and relate with. It affects our ability to measure the impact that social movements make, to understand why mass mobilizations are often considered failures, even when they're actually having very significant effects. Now, I know that there are a lot of social movement theory nerds out here. I'm not alone. So if these are questions that you've thought about yourself, that you're thinking about in your work, I'd love to talk more either in Q&A or after this session. I'll be out there at the table. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.